All right, so let's take a look at some of the more creative features. We talked about workflow. There's a whole bunch of features actually that we won't necessarily be showing. Actually, in passing, you can see here now that Batch supports breakable links. If you want to, it's as easy as adding them or deleting them as you would on a regular spline. Okay, so we can make it for cleaner schematics. But anyway, so we're going to focus on an example here. Where we talked earlier about differences between media effects, Matchbox being applied to textures, and Lightbox, this new thing that we alluded to that's coming up. So we'll try and show some of the differences between those things and how they complement each other. So I have an action set up here that's relatively simple. If I look at the schematic here, a key here, a couple of lights, a substance backdrop that I'm sourcing so that I can actually apply a defocus blur. And actually it's just important to note that one of the effects of having the batch pipeline fitted into the action media pipeline is that now I get separate color correct, color warper here are separated, but also I get access to the full blur capacity, and you see right now it's set to defocus. So that's how I get like bokeh blur directly inside of action, and it's going to be pretty fast. Because it's the same GPU accelerated processing pipeline that we have through Batch that is being used inside of the media. All right, so now we want to talk a little bit more about Matchbox and how it exists in this texture space, which is halfway between the action scene and right after the media pipeline, okay? And so one thing that I'm going to show, like in this particular case here, we'd want to create like, the point of what we're going to show is try to build a look that's more dramatic and nicer than what we have here. It's very flat, what we have right now, and so we'll relight the scene, add some corrections and stuff like that, but directly in the context of the action scene. First thing that we see here is that we have some edge problems. I just did a very quick key, but there's no pixel spread that was involved here. And perhaps I'm going to start with showing that when you're in action and you make the node bin appear, you'll see that we now have a dedicated Matchbox section. I want to point out that we actually introduced quite a few new Matchboxes out there, and I'm just going to show you two of them like right now. But I certainly encourage people to take a closer look at what's in that folder that we package. Of course, there's some great stuff out there from the guys of Matchbook.
One I want to touch on is the front and matte adjustment.
Oh, that's a good
Matchbox,
point.
which is much faster than the
You're
workaround
right.
of using a source node.
So I want to mention this particular Matchbox in passing, because for anyone who is actually accustomed to using source nodes just for the purpose of offsetting a matte and a front, this is much, much better and much, much faster. So from now on, do not use a source node to just offset a matte and a front. This is significantly faster. Much more efficient and very clean, a very clean result. But let's take a look at how in this particular case, what I'd want to do first is, in the context of my actual scene, do a little bit of pixel filling here on the edges of my key. So there is a subset of pixel spread that's actually available as a Matchbox. It's the parallax algorithm that is there, and so let's see how you actually apply it to an object. And it's relatively simple here. You see I selected an image. What's going to happen is if I try and drag a Matchbox, as I told you, Matchbox can only be applied to a texture. So what it's going to do is automatically kind of extract the diffuse texture of the object that is associated to it. And it will connect the parallax spread Matchbox directly to it. If I double click on it, it's going to expose a relatively simple UI. This is a UI that is constructed just with the XML files. Okay, so there are some constraints as to what you can do, but you'll see that there are also some new icons that are available, widgets that are available to Matchbox in this new release. So here I have parallax spread. And I can, if we take a look at what's happening here on the edges, you will notice that it's already kicking in as I adjust the values, you see it's very interactive. See, I can just, here you go. You see the effect instantly actually being applied to the scene, and this is actually being done in the context of the scene directly. So, so again, something that's very, very fast. You don't actually need to set a context on action. Just connect it directly to the texture that you want to affect, and add the parallax spread, and off you go. I find it's actually in many instances much more efficient to do that, and we'll see that one of the great benefits is that if you have, for example, a more complex scene with multiple instances, you can very easily apply the same correction to multiple textures. So we'll take a look actually perhaps at how you parent those things together, but it's a very quick way of affecting multiple objects in the action scene. So Matchbox can be applied to any kind of really texture map that we support inside of action. There's actually one exception right now. It's the position passes, I'm afraid, and it's due to the fact that we don't actually have a GPU path for the position passes. Contrary to displacement maps, for example. When we do, then that limitation will go away. So right now it's the only exception that kind of proves the rule, but every other map that we support in action can be affected by a matchbox. And so in this context, one of the things that we'd like to do is relight this scene. So one thing that's very cool to do is to extract the normals, for example, of that image. And so we have a matchbox that does that. We call it map extract. And so how would you use it on this particular image? Well, you would first go to the, make sure that you add a normal map and have your media selected from which you want to extract the normals, and just go ahead and add a normal map. Double click, it's connected here. And now at that point, I can go to Matchbox and locate the map extraction. And as I pointed out, actually Matchbox has its own set of node bins, Lightbox as well. What you decide to put in this node bin is entirely customizable. So by default, you'll have a direct access to the ones that we ship, but you can actually specify any directory that you would want to have as your favorite Matchbox shaders that you would want to use on a regular basis. Okay, so by default, it's going to be set to show you the ones that we ship with the software. Okay. So map extraction, with a normal map selection, double click and it actually adds the map extraction tool. As you see, it's already operating a normal extraction, but obviously this is a bit too intense. It doesn't exactly make his skin look better. So we want to make sure that we actually apply like a filter on the height to kind of smooth the normals here. And we're going to go for something like around this, and perhaps scale the normals also a little bit more. And you'll see that instantly, the minute that we start playing with the light in the scene, and we have a light here, it's already going to have a very different effect in the scene compared to with and without. If I had hide the map extraction, you see that it does make for a very big difference in what we get as a result. That's quite a big difference. If I hide I was hiding the light, so that's why it was turning off. But here you see the effect is quite different with and without the normals at this point. All right. So one of the things that I want to do here in this particular example is relighting, and so I'm going to increase the intensity of that light to kind of create something that's a bit more intense. And as you see here, we are taking advantage of the smooth normals that are kind of rounding the way that the light is being applied onto my image here. And so you can have multiple matchbox that are applied to the same diffuse, by the way, or to the same texture. Okay, they are automatically daisy chained together, and you can actually use. You'll notice that in the priority editor, there is now a matchbox section that allow you to, per texture, to determine which order in which the matchbox should actually be applied. You just use the priority editor as you would. And by the way, it's a revamped priority editor in case you haven't noticed. And we'll see also that there are other sections like lights that are now available here to deal with lightbox priorities in a very similar way. Okay, so now that I've done that, here we've seen, again, Matchbox in action, in the context of action. Let's take a look at something that is kind of complementary, which is Lightbox. And Lightbox is something, so you see here I have my main key light here that is an active light. And Lightbox is a shader that effectively attaches to a light and will project its effect into the action scene. But because it is connected to a lighting framework, it is also going to respect, for example, the exclusive links that we have in the action scene. So if I take a look at my node bin, my action node bin, you will notice that there's also a Lightbox bin, and so I can directly drag something into my schematic and it will attach to the light. But there's also another way of adding a Matchbox or a Lightbox. You will find that there's a generic Matchbox node or a generic Lightbox node that is here. And if I just double click on it, it's instead of actually dragging the specific Lightbox that I selected from the node bin, it's going to take me to the browsing. And sometimes it's easier to browse because we have like the picons that kind of illustrate what's in store. I do want to point out that with this release, just as is the case with the Matchbox, we are releasing quite a few Lightbox shaders that primarily pertain to color correction, okay? And while some of the tools that we will show you are directly inspired by the existing color correct, there are some functionality that are not found in our existing color correction tools. So things like luminance curves, where you can deal with saturations versus luminance, is something that only exists as a Matchbox and a Lightbox now. Lift gamma gain is here. We have color temperature also that can be adjusted. We have white balance also that is there. We have color swapping. We have color tone. Actually, we're going to be using that a little bit later. And we also have a range of things that are very unique to the approach, which are selectives that actually understand 3D space. And perhaps we'll take a look at that, a brief look at that later if we have time. So anyway, there's a range of tools that are there that pertain to color in general that should not be overlooked. It goes beyond what is actually currently available in just our legacy color correction tools in Flame. In this particular case, I'm actually going to choose a, what was it? Was it a basic color? No, a color correct. Okay, let's go. And as you see, the Lightbox directly attaches to the light that was selected. And of course, as I said, I could have directly extracted color correct from the node bin. The difference is one takes me to the browser, the one immediately connects the shader to the light. At that point, this is, if I double click on this, you'll see a UI that is somewhat inspired by the color corrector. With some differences. We have some limitations as to what we do because it's an XML file that actually dictates what appears in the UI, and so it may be not as elegant as something that would be a custom tool that we develop.
At the same time, though, you points out the good time to mention that you see a new widget here, which is the color wheel, which is also available within Matchbox in this release.
All the widgets, such as the curves, the color curves, the RGB curves, all of those things are actually the color wheel. All of these are actually available for both Matchbox and Lightbox. So it's a cool extension to create new types of tools with these widgets as well. All right, so this is the color corrector. You'll find shadows, master shadows, midtones, highlights, and also a list of controls here that allow you to decide how the shadows versus the highlights get distributed relatively to the midtones. But also interesting things such as a 6-vector suppression. Now, in the color corrector, this is typically handled by buttons, but in this case, we actually have sliders that allow you to determine how much you want to suppress. And again, this is something that is not available in the traditional batch color corrector or even the indirect module, which is now identical to the batch color corrector. Here you have this extra flexibility of deciding actually how much you actually want to suppress. I'm not going to use this in this case. Here what I want to do is to produce a look that is somewhat dramatic. So I've boosted my light, and now I'm going to add to this a projected gamma correction. So I'm going to create something that's fairly dramatic. Goes something like this. This is already a lot more moody. And since my background substance texture is yellowish, I'm going to go for something also that goes in that same direction. So something that would be in the yellows like this, and right, there we go. Of course, I can actually I can actually drag directly in the widget. It's fully functional here. Let me set it to these numbers here, and I think we're okay. Oops, something like that. All right, and so at this point, the light is effectively casting color correction, and the effect of the color correction is actually being mitigated by the normals. So whatever orientation is detected in 3D space, whether it's from actual polygons or from a normal map information, or polygons affected by a displacement map, all of these things are actually going to mitigate the effect of the actual shader in the action scene. And so these shaders can actually understand the distance, just like a light. They understand the incidence. They understand a whole bunch of things that come from the action scene. And as we mentioned very briefly before, they also respect the lighting framework, which means that if I sever the link that I have here, the lighting link here, automatically the color correction that is somewhat drastic gets also applied on the background image. I don't want that at this point. I only want this to affect my foreground character talent. And so I'm just going to maintain the exclusive link. But I wanted to make sure that people understood that the exact same habits that you develop with lights are actually applicable to Lightbox shaders as well. So the next thing that I want to do is perhaps add a bit more intensity in his eyes when he looks up, when the character looks up. And to do that, here I have another light that's effectively it's an area light. Okay. And if we take a look at, so that right now that light is actually not active. And one thing that I want to mention is that lights do not have to be active to project a lightbox effect into the scene. In the first example that I showed here with this particular light, I do want to accumulate the effect of a color correction to the effect of the light. Okay, so both are being cast through the same light simultaneously. Both effects are being accumulated. In this case, what I want to do is just use another light box to just try and boost the color of his eyes when he looks up. Okay, and for that I have this area light, and I want to mention one thing here is that lights have actually been considerably improved. First of all, we have a parametric profile curve now that you can use to create much smoother softening of the cone. And when I say parametric, it's essentially because it's a lot easier to kind of control the curve just with a set of parameters here to smoothen actually inward and outward. So that's one thing. So the other thing I want to show with the lights is that they also now have a target mode, which is explicit. So if, by default lights are in free mode, and this is very analogous to what we know already with a camera. So if I switch to target, it actually now has an explicit target. And in this particular context, you see that I've very quickly added 3 keyframes to animate the target, so that let me just show what happens if I activate the light briefly. You see where it's casting. And so that's actually going to act as a constraining cone for whatever I'm going to parent to that light, okay? So as I said, I don't need the light to be active for a lightbox to actually cast through this particular light. And so let me navigate back to my lightbox and to my lightbox tab, and I'm gonna go for a color selective this time. Color selective is a shader that when I add it to the scene, it allows me to do 2 things. First of all, do a selection of colors and only affect that selection of colors within the action scene. So you would say it's very banal in essence, but the point that I want to stress is that it's a selection of colors made in the actual result of the scene. So no matter how many objects you have, whatever you select is actually going to be potentially affected by the correction that you will do subsequently, all right? And it's scene-based at that point. It's not something that is media-based, all right? So here, if I switch to selective, I'm going to try and find a image where I can do something that's not too bad of a sampling. Let's go ahead and do an average. That's not going to be very easy, but let's try nonetheless. All right, there we go. And when I actually do a selection, I can activate selective viewing just to have a magenta overlay to illustrate what's actually going to be affected in the scene. If I, of course, I need to switch it off if I want to resample for one reason or another, and then I can resample. All right, let's see what's there. Okay. So, and from that point onwards, I can actually play with the ranges, and as I reduce the ranges, you see that it actually affects what gets affected. It changes what gets affected in the scene until we reduce it to something that's what we roughly want. So this is like it's probably going to be enough actually for what we want to do here. Even though it's not maybe the nicest selection. Typically you get away with murder with these things. Go back into the color tab, and here if I wanted to do something like increasing the gamma, you see now it will only affect whatever it is that I selected. And of course, if I also want to do a hue shift, for example, to create, to shift things towards something that's green, you will see now that it actually is so the light is actually tracking the gaze just with those 3 keyframes as it's actually applying the actual color correction through the cone of the light. So the cone of the light acts as a second constraint, kind of like a softening mask or a softening window in 3D space actually to constrain the selection that was done purely based on color and pixels. So I guess, you know, again, something like a different approach to dealing with a problem. And of course, you could have done that also with a G-mask on the media and a whole bunch of stuff. The interesting thing here, I guess, is that it's being performed directly in the context of action and will actually, and it will change its behavior based also on the angle of incidence. So as you see, as the gaze goes down, there's a very limited impact, and it's kind of peaks when it's full incidence, frontal incidence, and then it gets reduced again as he moves the head up.
I think the other important thing to point out at this point as well is to reiterate the fact that if you happen to change, for instance, that overall color correction in the first light box you added, you will impact your selection.
Indeed, yes. Well, you will impact not necessarily the color that you picked, but you will impact the amount of pixels that are of the color that you picked. Right. Okay, so indeed it has an impact, because at this point, as I showed you earlier, we do have a priority editor that's also applicable to lights. Okay, and so right now what you see is the area light is actually above the main key light. The main key light is the one that we use to actually produce the lighting effect with the kind of the yellowish tint. And above that, we have the area of the eyes that then gets applied to that with a selective. So indeed, the order in which those things gets applied is very important. And in this context, it's always bottom to top, just like regular action layers, actually. And in that respect, you can totally see what we're doing here as a very action version of an adjustment layer, except again, it gets applied through a light and is indifferent to whatever's in front of it in 3D space. So it's something to remember. Here on the backdrop here, let's take a look at something else that we did. There's another very big area light here that gets applied to a wide portion of the image, and this is another color correction that is being applied here, and it's to illustrate another fact is that within the controls, you will also, for example, be able to determine what the blending mode of the color correction is going to be, and so this is just a simple color correction. We've changed the gamma again. You will notice again that the way that it gets applied into the scene is fairly dramatic. As it is going to react. It's only applied right now to the background, okay? So I'm selectively applying it to the background, and as I move it in the scene, you see that it's a very effective way of just kind of creating an atmosphere in the shot that gets projected really from the light. And at that point, if I wanted to, I could also have like an extra degree of freedom, and I could actually adjust various blend modes to make the effect more or less intense. So I've got a very wide variety of blend modes. A lot of them are also common to should be familiar also to people who use Photoshop. And actually it opens the possibility of applying very Photoshop-like color correction methodologies in Action's 3D space. And again, those tools will impact both geometries or images in the action scene. And so Lightbox, contrary to Matchbox, is really operating on objects that are in the scene. Matchbox is happening really in the antechamber of the scene. It's being applied to the texture. Lightbox is really, through the lighting system, effectively casting onto actual objects in the scene. So one last thing also that I'd like to show here is like we'd want to have an overall vignette. Actually, there are two things perhaps that we're going to complement. We're going to add a vignette effect on the overall scene. So here I already have a G mask that I just added to the scene. So that's kind of weird because on its own it's instantly creating a transparency effect into the action scene. But we will see that G masks can actually affect lights and Lightbox shaders as well. All right, so I'm navigating back into my Lightbox, and I'm going to pick a basic color, which is essentially all the basic tool set of color corrector. Very simple, very fast. Drag it into the schematic. And at that point, what it's going to do is automatically create a light that gets associated to it. And so one thing that you should know is that a G mask can actually constrain a light and a Lightbox. And the only thing that you need to do is to actually use the G mask link connection to create a link between the G mask and the light. And what this will do is automatically cancel the transparency effect in the action scene and tell the light at that point to be constrained by the effect of the G mask. One thing to consider is, though, when you drag a Lightbox, as I did, is that it will create a light that is positioned in a different coordinate as what you're accustomed to. It's not as 100 Z coordinates, it's further away, and it also has a spread by default. Here, in this particular case, I only want to see the effect of my G mask, so I'm actually going to cancel any spread that I have on my light just to make sure that it shines flat through the actual G mask that I drew and added. And so right now that G mask is actually located pretty much almost at the center of the world. And let's see what happens now if once I have this constraint link and my G mask is actually set also to invert. This is going to be useful now to create like a vignetting effect that we wanted to do. And so if I start offsetting, you see now it's creating the effect through the G mask at that point. And if I move my G mask up and down, you see that right now it is acting very much as a constraint to the actual basic color correction that I'm applying.
It's acting almost as a gobo of sorts.
So you're right to point out, John, that it's kind of like a gobo, but to the point where the G mask is really casting color correction just as an object would cast a shadow relatively to the light. So the relative position of the G mask to the light is actually going to dictate what gets affected, kind of like a keyhole, really. The GMask acts as a keyhole.
And I think the other thing here to point out that is being restricted by the GMask, but since there's no selective lighting going on, you're impacting every object in the scene.
You're right, indeed. So this is effectively acting as an overall vignetting effect on all of the objects that are presently represented in the action scene. So it's a simple scene. There are only 2 layers here, but both of them are actually presently affected by my vignetting effect. And of course, this is all live for me to change directly inside of the action scene, or changing here the gradient values. All of that can actually be adjusted live to create something that's more or less, visible in the scene. So one last thing perhaps that we'll try to do is to also illustrate how all of those things are coming together. Here I have also a lens flare, and it's a very greenish lens flare that we have here. And something that wasn't necessarily very easy to do in previous releases was to actually color correct the lens flare, okay? In the absence also of an action output that would only output the lens flares, it's been traditionally difficult to tackle that problem. With the introduction of Matchbox, it becomes very easy. And here what I'm going to do is switch to my Matchbox node bin. Remember that a lens flare is effectively a collection of textures that get stamped as a post-process in the action scene. That's what happens. But because they're textures, they can be affected by a Matchbox. Okay? And so I'm going to use here a color tone Matchbox, and I'm just going to apply it essentially to all these various textures, okay? And what color tone does is that you can actually dictate what color should be the highlights and what color should be the shadows, okay? And so in this case, what I'm gonna do is just essentially go ahead and pick an average color, again, in my action scene. And as you see, my lens flare, all the various textures of my lens flare get instantly affected by my color tone operator. So even though this is something that is technically a post-process, lens flares get added on top of the rendered scene because the bricks that are necessary to build a lens flare are effectively textures. You can actually change their look through Matchbox color correction tools. So overall, you have a very kind of a sophisticated system that allow you to deal with problems in the context of a scene, in the antechamber of the scene, on the textures, and at the media level before it even gets piped into action, and even outside of action in batch. So lots of options, but they don't necessarily deliver the same service to you. And we saw together also that whether it's Matchbox or Lightbox, we are creating pipelines that can be daisy-chained, reordered. In the context of Matchbox, it's for every single texture. You can actually see what gets applied to them. So you have a Matchbox priority order here that is visible. The same thing for Lightbox, switching to lights, which means that lights now have also priorities. If you don't use any Lightboxes on lights, it's the priority editor has no effect. But if you start using Lightboxes shaders casting through various lights, then the order in which they get applied, and we saw that with the selective, is something that becomes very important and can be changed at leisure. It can be even animated over time. So, and that's one of the reasons that motivated us actually to revamp a little bit the priority editor inside of Action. So, again, one big distinguishing factor is a lot of the things that I showed you with Lightbox can be totally generalized to a 3D scene. And it will actually allow you to do blend modes, cast effects in the scene, and create effectively pipelines, also effects that are being cast in the scene. So once again, if we recap, we actually acted at 3 different levels in the action scene. We added, like adding the defocus here. This is a media effects, one that has been there for, traditionally been there for a very long time in action, replaced by batch now. We then moved on to the texture space, which is not exactly in the scene, not quite in the scene, but not quite a media yet. And this is where actually Matchbox operates. We've seen how any kind of texture map can actually be affected by one or multiple matchboxes, priority editor also to change the order in which those things are applied. And the last thing that we also use to affect the scene, and the actual scene this time, is a Lightbox shader. And the difference between Matchbox and Lightbox is, again, contrary to Matchbox, Lightbox is really modifying the colors of pixels of objects that are represented inside of action, while Matchbox modifies the textures that get applied to these objects. So again, 3 different levels at which you can operate inside of action, and they do not deliver exactly the same service to you. So that's, in a nutshell, I think what I wanted to present to you at a very high level for the look development stuff that we introduced in 2016.